Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was an American serial killer and sex offender who systematically murdered and dismembered 17 young men and boys between 1978 and 1991, engaging in acts of necrophilia, cannibalism, and the preservation of body parts while transforming his victims into objects of his twisted fantasies through torture, experimentation, and the meticulous documentation of his crimes through Polaroid photographs. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Lionel Herbert Dahmer and Joyce Annette Dahmer, entering a world that would soon become fraught with dysfunction and neglect. His father, a Marquette University chemistry student who would later become a research chemist, was of German and Welsh ancestry, while his mother, a teletype machine instructor of Norwegian and Irish descent, suffered from severe mental health issues that would profoundly impact Jeffrey's early development. From the very beginning, the Dahmer household was marked by instability and emotional turmoil. Joyce Dahmer struggled with depression, anxiety, and prescription drug addiction, often taking as many as 26 pills a day and remaining constantly sedated. She was known to be tense, greedy for both attention and pity, and argumentative with her husband and neighbors, creating an atmosphere of perpetual conflict. During the latter months of her first pregnancy, Joyce experienced increased mental breakdowns and seizures, which according to her doctor were rooted in her mental rather than physical state, contributing to her severe addiction to barbiturates and morphine. As Jeffrey entered first grade, his father's academic pursuits and later career demands kept him away from home much of the time, leaving the young boy without consistent paternal guidance or emotional support. When Lionel was home, he found himself dealing with a wife who demanded constant attention and spent increasing amounts of time in bed, on one occasion even attempting suicide using Equinol. The household was characterized by extreme tension and numerous arguments between the parents, leading Jeffrey to feel from an early age that he was unsure of the solidity of the family. The transformation of Jeffrey Dahmer from what was described as an energetic and happy child into something far more disturbing began at age 4, when he underwent double hernia surgery shortly before his birthday. This traumatic medical experience, which involved significant pain and a frightening recovery period during which Jeffrey feared someone had cut his genitals, seemed to mark a fundamental change in his personality. After waking from anesthesia worried about the state of his body, Jeffrey became notably subdued and increasingly withdrawn, developing a profound distrust of the world around him. The surgery's impact was compounded by the fact that it was never properly explained to the young child, leaving him to grapple with fear and confusion about what had happened to his body. This experience, combined with the birth of his younger brother David when Jeffrey was 6, further unsettled him and contributed to his growing sense of isolation and abandonment. His shyness and low self-esteem hindered his ability to connect with peers, making him increasingly isolated from normal childhood social interactions. At elementary school, teachers noticed Jeffrey was quiet and timid, with one instructor detecting early signs of abandonment issues stemming from his father's absence and mother's frequent illnesses. The symptoms of family dysfunction became more pronounced when Joyce became pregnant with her second child, adding additional stress to an already unstable household. By the time Jeffrey was 6 years old, the family had moved from Wisconsin to Ohio, another disruption that further contributed to his emotional instability. It was during this period that Jeffrey's fascination with death and decay began to manifest in deeply disturbing ways. From a young age, he developed an obsession with animal bones, collecting and studying them with an intensity that worried those around him. He would help his father tend to injured animals they found, including an owl and several other creatures, but his interest took on a more sinister dimension when he began seeking out dead animals in various states of decomposition. When Jeffrey was 4 years old, his father discovered him playing with bones from dead animals, touching them and breaking them into pieces in what appeared to be a thrilling experience for the child. This early fascination with bones and decay was encouraged, albeit unknowingly, by his father Lionel, who believed he was nurturing his son's scientific interests by teaching him how to strip flesh from roadkill using chemicals. The father and son would search for roadkill together, with Jeffrey learning the techniques he would later use to dissolve the bodies of his victims. The young Jeffrey would collect large insects and the skulls of small animals, preserving them in jars of formaldehyde, creating what amounted to a private museum of death in his childhood bedroom. Under the family house, he would create burial sites for animals, stripping flesh from roadkill, and even mounting a dog's head on a stake. These activities, which might have seemed like normal childhood curiosity about nature to some observers, represented something far more troubling in Jeffrey's case. As Jeffrey grew older, the dysfunction in his family intensified. His parents' marriage continued to deteriorate, marked by frequent arguments and emotional distance that left Jeffrey feeling increasingly isolated. The lack of emotional support and nurturing at home contributed to his inability to form empathetic bonds with others, a critical failure in his psychological development that would have devastating consequences later in life. The constant tension and numerous arguments between his parents during his early years created an atmosphere of instability that fundamentally shaped Jeffrey's worldview. Research in developmental psychology emphasizes the importance of early attachment in shaping prosocial behavior, and Jeffrey's apparent failure to establish secure attachments during his formative years likely contributed to his emotional numbness and lack of conscience that would manifest so horrifically in adulthood. A particularly traumatic incident occurred when Jeffrey was 6 years old, involving a classmate who invited him to play a game that would have lasting psychological impact. The friend asked Jeffrey to strangle him, promising not to tell the teachers, but when Jeffrey complied, the boy immediately went to the teacher anyway, resulting in Jeffrey receiving punishment that taught him a devastating lesson about trusting others. This betrayal by someone he trusted contributed significantly to his reluctance to form genuine relationships and may have influenced his later inability to allow victims to leave alive once he had control over them. By the time Jeffrey reached his teenage years, the damage from his troubled childhood had created a deeply disturbed individual who was becoming increasingly dangerous to himself and others. The combination of parental neglect, medical trauma, social isolation, and exposure to his mother's mental health struggles had created the foundation for what would become one of the most horrific criminal careers in American history. During his high school years, Jeffrey became a social outcast who had developed a serious drinking problem, sometimes even bringing alcohol to school. Teachers and peers noticed his erratic behavior and substance abuse, but these warning signs were largely ignored or dismissed by adults who might have intervened. It was around this time, at age 14, that Jeffrey began to recognize his sexual orientation and experience the emergence of violent sexual fantasies involving murder and necrophilia. The teenage Jeffrey would engage in bizarre behavior to gain attention from his classmates, including faking seizures or mimicking people with disabilities for laughs. While teachers noted his intelligence, they were also aware of his growing disengagement from school and his increasing reliance on alcohol to cope with his emotional pain. His deepening isolation and emotional suppression coincided with the surfacing of the violent sexual fantasies that would eventually drive him to commit murder. On June 18, 1978, just weeks after graduating from high school, 18-year-old Jeffrey Dahmer committed his first murder, an act that would mark the beginning of a 13-year killing spree that would terrorize communities across the Midwest. The victim was Stephen Mark Hicks, also 18 years old, described by his father Richard as a compassionate young man who had recently graduated from high school in Coventry Township, Ohio. The encounter began innocuously enough when Hicks was hitchhiking to a rock concert, seeking nothing more than transportation to enjoy music with friends. Dahmer, driving alone and nursing the violent fantasies that had been brewing in his mind for years, spotted the hitchhiker and saw an opportunity to fulfill desires he had been harboring since adolescence. He later told Inside Edition in 1993, "I always knew that it was wrong. The first killing was not planned. I was coming back from the shopping mall back in '78. I'd had fantasies about picking up a hitchhiker and taking him back to the house and having complete dominance and control over him." Dahmer offered Hicks a ride, and the unsuspecting teenager accepted, having no way of knowing that he was climbing into a vehicle with someone who harbored dark intentions. Instead of taking Hicks to his intended destination, Dahmer convinced him to come to his parents' house in Bath Township, Ohio, under the pretense of drinking beer and smoking marijuana together. The house was empty, as Jeffrey's parents were going through their bitter divorce and his father was away. At the house, the two young men initially engaged in what appeared to be normal social interaction, drinking alcohol and talking. However, when Hicks expressed his desire to leave and attempted to do so, Dahmer was confronted with the reality that his fantasy of complete control was about to end. Unable to accept the loss of power over another human being, and driven by compulsions he had been nurturing for years, Dahmer made the decision that would transform him from someone who merely fantasized about violence into an actual killer. Using a 10-pound barbell, Dahmer struck Hicks in the head with tremendous force, immediately incapacitating the young man. The violence did not end there, as Dahmer continued the assault, strangling and beating Hicks with the barbell until he was certain his victim was dead. The methodical nature of the attack demonstrated that even in his first murder, Dahmer displayed the calculated brutality that would characterize all of his subsequent crimes. After killing Hicks, Dahmer was faced with the practical problem of disposing of the body, a challenge that would require the same chemical knowledge his father had inadvertently taught him through their roadkill experiments. Using a sledgehammer, Dahmer systematically dismembered Hicks's corpse, breaking down the body into manageable pieces that could be more easily disposed of. The dismemberment process was carried out with a level of detachment that suggested Dahmer had already begun to view human beings as objects rather than people. The disposal of Stephen Hicks's remains was elaborate and demonstrated Dahmer's understanding of decomposition and evidence destruction. After dismembering the body, he buried the remains in plastic bags in the woods behind his parents' house, believing this would permanently conceal his crime. However, the psychological impact of the murder on Dahmer was significant, as he later admitted that no one had a clue as to what was happening for over a decade. The Hicks murder established several patterns that would characterize Dahmer's future crimes, including his preference for victims who were vulnerable and isolated, his use of deception to gain control, and his methodical approach to killing and body disposal. The fact that he was able to commit this murder without detection gave him confidence that he could continue to kill without being caught, a belief that would prove tragically accurate for many years. Perhaps most significantly, the murder of Stephen Hicks served as a gateway experience for Dahmer, transforming violent fantasy into violent reality. He later reflected on those 9 years following the Hicks murder, during which he did not kill again, saying, "There just wasn't an opportunity to fully express what I wanted to do. There was just not the physical opportunity to do it then." This statement reveals that the urge to kill had been constant since 1978, but circumstances had not aligned to allow him to act on these impulses. The remains of Stephen Hicks were not discovered until 1991, following Dahmer's confession after his arrest. By that time, 13 years had passed, and what little physical evidence remained had been severely degraded by time and the elements. The delayed discovery of Hicks's remains meant that for over a decade, his family lived without knowing what had happened to their son, adding an additional layer of tragedy to an already horrific crime. The murder of Stephen Hicks also demonstrated Dahmer's ability to compartmentalize his actions and continue functioning in society despite having committed such a heinous act. Just weeks after committing his first murder, he began college at Ohio State University as a business major, attempting to maintain the facade of a normal young adult beginning his life. However, his inability to focus on anything other than his violent urges, combined with his increasing alcohol abuse, led to his dropping out after just one semester. Following his failed attempt at college, Jeffrey Dahmer's father, desperate to find structure and direction for his troubled son, encouraged him to enlist in the United States Army in January 1979. Lionel Dahmer hoped that military discipline and a change of environment might provide the structure Jeffrey seemed to need, unaware that his son had already crossed the line into murder just months earlier. Dahmer initially enlisted to serve with the military police, but was transferred to medical specialist training at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas, where he completed a 6-week program that would make him a combat medic. The irony of a killer being trained to save lives was lost on military officials who saw Jeffrey as an unremarkable recruit with no obvious red flags. In July 1979, Dahmer was stationed in Baumholder, West Germany, in the Rhineland-Palatinate state, where he served as a combat medic with the 68th Armored Regiment, 8th Infantry Division. His duties involved helping as the military equivalent of a nurse's aide, screening patients, and providing basic medical care. During his first year of service, he was rated as average or slightly above average by his superiors, who saw no indication of the darkness he harbored. However, beneath the veneer of military professionalism, Dahmer's time in Germany was marked by disturbing behavior that went largely unnoticed or unreported by his fellow servicemen. One of his fellow soldiers later claimed that Dahmer repeatedly raped him over a 17-month period, a horrific pattern of sexual violence that demonstrated Dahmer's escalating predatory behavior even while serving his country. The victim's inability to report these assaults due to the military culture of the time and attitudes toward male-on-male sexual assault meant that Dahmer's crimes went unpunished and unrecorded. The sexual assaults Dahmer committed during his military service represented a significant escalation from his single murder of Stephen Hicks. While he had not killed again, he was clearly acting on violent sexual impulses and demonstrating the predatory behavior that would characterize his later crimes. The fact that he was able to repeatedly victimize a fellow soldier without consequences likely reinforced his belief that he could continue to harm others without facing justice. Dahmer's performance in the military began to deteriorate significantly during his second year of service, primarily due to his excessive alcohol consumption. The drinking problem that had begun in high school intensified during his time in Germany, where he had access to alcohol, and the stress of military life combined with his internal struggles to create a dangerous situation. His superiors noticed that his drinking was impairing his ability to function as a soldier, but they did not connect his alcohol abuse to any deeper psychological problems. German authorities later investigated possible connections between Dahmer and several unsolved murders that occurred in the area during his time of service, though no definitive links were established. The fact that these investigations were deemed necessary suggests that Dahmer's behavior during his military service was suspicious enough to warrant scrutiny, even if concrete evidence was never found. 5 unsolved murder cases from the time of his deployment were re-examined, indicating that local authorities believed there was at least a possibility that Dahmer had continued killing while in Germany. On March 24, 1981, Dahmer's military career came to an end when his superiors decided that his drinking had made him unsuitable for continued service. Despite the severity of his alcohol problem and the impact it had on his military duties, Dahmer received an honorable discharge rather than a dishonorable one, a decision that would have significant implications for his future. The discharge was processed under Chapter 9 of the Code of Military Justice, which pertains to substance abuse by military personnel. The decision to give Dahmer an honorable discharge was based on his superior's belief that his drinking and performance problems would not significantly impact his ability to function in civilian life. This assessment proved to be tragically incorrect, as the same issues that made him unsuitable for military service would soon contribute to a murder spree that would claim 16 more lives. Had Dahmer been given a dishonorable discharge or faced court-martial proceedings for his alleged sexual assaults, the trajectory of his life and the lives of his future victims might have been very different. After his discharge, Dahmer was given a plane ticket to any destination within the United States. He chose to fly to Miami Beach, where he spent several months working at a delicatessen. However, his alcohol problems followed him to Florida, and he was eventually evicted from his hotel for failure to pay rent. This pattern of instability and failure to maintain employment would continue throughout his life, contributing to his isolation and providing opportunities for his criminal behavior. The military service period represented a crucial time in Dahmer's development as a killer, even though he apparently did not commit any murders during this time. The combination of medical training, exposure to violence, and the opportunity to act on his sexual deviances with impunity helped shape him into the methodical predator he would become. The fact that he was able to maintain a facade of normalcy while committing sexual assaults demonstrated his ability to compartmentalize his criminal behavior, a skill that would serve him well in his later crimes. When Dahmer returned to the United States in 1981, he was a more dangerous individual than when he had left. His military experience had not provided the structure and rehabilitation his father had hoped for, but had instead given him additional skills and confidence that he would use in service of his violent impulses. The weapons training, medical knowledge, and ability to function under stress that he had acquired in the military would all prove useful in his future career as a serial killer. After his honorable discharge from the Army in March 1981, Jeffrey Dahmer found himself adrift, struggling with alcoholism and the violent urges that continued to plague him despite his attempts to find stability through military service. His return to civilian life was marked by immediate problems that demonstrated his inability to function normally in society, foreshadowing the chaos and violence that would soon follow. Dahmer briefly returned to his parents' home in Ohio, but his presence there created immediate tension and conflict. His alcohol abuse had worsened during his military service, and he was unable to control his drinking even in the supposedly stable environment of his childhood home. Within months of his return, he was arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct, an incident that highlighted his inability to manage his behavior even in simple social situations. The arrest for public intoxication was Dahmer's first official encounter with law enforcement since the murder of Stephen Hicks, and it demonstrated that his problems were escalating rather than improving. He was fined and received a suspended jail sentence, punishment that seemed minor compared to the severity of his underlying issues, but which served as a warning sign that went unheeded. The incident convinced his parents that he needed a change of environment and different influences if he was going to have any chance of turning his life around. Hoping that his paternal grandmother Catherine Dahmer would provide a stabilizing influence, Jeffrey's parents made the decision to send him to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where she lived in the suburb of West Dallas. Catherine, who lived at 2357 South 57th Street in a house that still stands today, was seen by the family as someone who might be able to provide the emotional support and structure that Jeffrey seemed to need. His father later told the Milwaukee Sentinel, "This was probably very wrong to do, but I didn't have the wisdom to do anything differently, and we sent him to his grandmother's to live there." A new scene. They loved each other, and he'd help her with the chores. The move to his grandmother's house in August 1982 initially seemed promising, as Jeffrey appeared to be making an effort to establish some stability in his life. Catherine Dahmer was a devout woman who provided the kind of consistent, caring presence that had been missing from Jeffrey's childhood. She welcomed her grandson into her home and genuinely cared for him, having no idea of the darkness he carried with him or the crimes he had already committed. However, even in this more stable environment, Jeffrey's problems persisted and began to manifest in increasingly disturbing ways. Just months after moving in with his grandmother, he was arrested again, this time for indecently exposing himself at the Wisconsin State Fair Park. The incident, which occurred in August 1982, resulted in his conviction and a $50 fine, but more importantly, it demonstrated that his sexual deviances were becoming more public and difficult to control. The pattern of arrests continued in August 1986, when Dahmer was charged with disorderly conduct after being accused of masturbating in front of two boys. When confronted by authorities, he claimed he was merely urinating, but the charges stuck, and he was sentenced to 1 year of probation and ordered to undergo counseling. This incident was particularly significant because it involved children as victims, indicating that his sexual deviances were expanding to include minors and that he was becoming bolder in his criminal behavior. Despite these legal troubles, Catherine Dahmer continued to support her grandson, unaware that he was using her basement and garage as locations for increasingly disturbing activities. During his time at her house, Jeffrey began bringing men home from Milwaukee's gay bars, initially for consensual encounters, but increasingly for purposes that were far more sinister. His grandmother, who was frequently away visiting relatives or attending church functions, had no idea what was happening under her roof. The basement of Catherine's house became Jeffrey's laboratory for experimentation with death and dismemberment. Using the chemical knowledge he had learned from his father during their roadkill experiments, he began refining techniques for dissolving flesh and bone that would later prove essential in his disposal of human victims. Neighbors occasionally complained about strange smells and sounds coming from the property, but these concerns were dismissed as minor nuisances rather than signs of something more serious. During this period, Jeffrey also began working various jobs in Milwaukee, including positions at a blood plasma center and later at the Ambrosia Chocolate Company. His job at the plasma center was particularly ironic given his fascination with death and bodily fluids, and coworkers later reported that he seemed unusually interested in the blood collection process. His work at the chocolate factory provided him with a legitimate source of income and a veneer of normalcy that helped him blend into society while concealing his growing obsession with murder. The years Jeffrey spent at his grandmother's house, from 1982 to 1990, represented a crucial period in his development as a serial killer. While he committed no murders during the first 5 years of this period, he was clearly preparing for a return to killing through his experiments with animal remains and his increasing boldness in pursuing victims. The stability provided by his grandmother's home gave him the secure base he needed to plan and execute the crimes that would soon follow. By 1987, 9 years after his first murder, Jeffrey Dahmer was ready to kill again. The combination of his growing confidence, his refined techniques for body disposal, and his increasing inability to control his violent urges created the perfect storm for a resumption of his criminal career. The long gap between his first murder and his next had allowed him to perfect his methods and develop the psychological strategies he would need to avoid detection while committing multiple murders. The environment at his grandmother's house also provided Jeffrey with the privacy and space he needed to commit murder without immediate detection. The basement offered a secluded location where he could kill, dismember, and dispose of bodies without neighbors or his grandmother being aware of what was happening. The fact that Catherine was often away from the house for extended periods gave him the freedom to bring victims home and carry out his crimes without interruption. As 1987 began, Jeffrey Dahmer was a 26-year-old man who had spent 9 years thinking about murder, refining his techniques, and building the psychological framework he would need to become one of America's most prolific serial killers. The stage was set for a resumption of killing that would claim 15 more lives over the next 4 years and terrorize communities across the Midwest. After 9 years of containing his murderous urges through fantasy, alcohol, and various minor criminal acts, Jeffrey Dahmer's restraint finally collapsed in September 1987 when he committed his second murder, killing 28-year-old Stephen Walter Twomey at the Ambassador Hotel in Milwaukee. This murder marked the beginning of an accelerating pattern of violence that would eventually claim 15 more lives over the following 4 years, establishing Dahmer as one of the most prolific and disturbing serial killers in American history. Stephen Twomey was a quiet, artistic man who had moved to Milwaukee from Ontonagon in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, where he worked as a short-order cook and was remembered by his classmates for his talent in art class. Like so many of Dahmer's victims, Twomey was marginalized and unlikely to be immediately missed when he disappeared, fitting the pattern of victim selection that would characterize all of Dahmer's subsequent crimes. He was last seen alive on September 15, 1987, when he encountered Dahmer at a gay bar in Milwaukee. The circumstances of Twomey's death were particularly disturbing because Dahmer claimed to have no memory of the actual killing. According to Dahmer's later confession, he had invited Twomey back to a room at the Ambassador Hotel, where they drank heavily and both lost consciousness. When Dahmer awoke the following morning, he found Twomey dead in the bed beside him, with blood coming from his mouth and bruising on his chest that suggested he had been beaten to death. Dahmer's claim that he had no recollection of killing Twomey was met with skepticism by investigators, who believed he was attempting to minimize his culpability in what was clearly a violent murder. However, whether the killing was planned or the result of a drunken rage, the aftermath demonstrated the methodical approach that would characterize all of Dahmer's future crimes. Rather than panicking or calling for help, he calmly set about concealing the murder and disposing of the body in a manner that showed considerable planning and forethought. The disposal of Twomey's body required Dahmer to transport the corpse from the hotel to his grandmother's house without detection, a logistical challenge that he approached with chilling efficiency. He purchased a large suitcase, placed Twomey's body inside, and transported it to the basement of his grandmother's home in West Dallas. The fact that he was able to carry out this transportation in broad daylight without arousing suspicion demonstrated both his audacity and his understanding of how to avoid detection. Once in his grandmother's basement, Dahmer began the process of dismemberment that would become his signature. Using techniques he had learned from his father's roadkill experiments and refined through his own experimentation with animal remains, he systematically broke down Twomey's body into manageable pieces. The process was carried out with a level of detachment and technical proficiency that suggested he had been mentally preparing for this moment for years. The dismemberment of Stephen Twomey took place over the course of several days, with Dahmer methodically removing flesh from bone using various chemicals and tools. He disposed of most of the body parts in his grandmother's trash, confident that they would be collected and disposed of before anyone could identify them as human remains. However, he retained Twomey's head for approximately a week, boiling it in industrial detergent and bleach until the flesh was completely removed. The skull was then pulverized, completing the destruction of the physical evidence of his crime. This pattern of partial preservation followed by complete destruction would become a hallmark of Dahmer's methods, reflecting his desire to maintain some connection to his victims while still ensuring that evidence of his crimes was eliminated. The fact that he kept the head for an extended period suggests that he was already developing the ritualistic aspects of his killing that would become more elaborate in later murders. The murder of Stephen Twomey was significant not just for ending the 9-year gap in Dahmer's killing, but for establishing the basic pattern that would characterize all of his subsequent crimes. The victim was a marginalized individual unlikely to be immediately missed. The killing took place in a controlled environment, and the aftermath involved methodical dismemberment and disposal designed to eliminate evidence. Most importantly, Dahmer demonstrated that he could commit murder and carry on with his normal life as if nothing had happened. Unlike his first murder of Stephen Hicks, which had been followed by years of apparent inactivity, the killing of Stephen Twomey seemed to unleash something in Dahmer that could not be contained. The long gap between murders had not diminished his urges, but had instead allowed them to intensify and become more sophisticated. The technical skills he had developed over the intervening years, combined with the confidence gained from successfully concealing his first murder for nearly a decade, made him a far more dangerous predator. The fact that Dahmer was never charged in connection with Twomey's murder, despite his confession, was due to the lack of physical evidence. By the time he confessed in 1991, for years had passed since the killing, and Dahmer's efficient disposal methods had eliminated any trace of the victim's remains. This successful concealment likely reinforced his belief that he could continue killing without facing consequences, contributing to the escalation that would follow. The psychological impact of the Twomey murder on Dahmer was profound, as it marked his transition from someone who had killed once in a moment of rage to someone who was actively seeking opportunities to kill again. The experience of waking up next to a dead body, rather than traumatizing him or deterring him from further violence, seemed to excite him and fuel his desire for more control over life and death. This reaction confirmed that he had fully embraced his identity as a killer and was ready to pursue murder as a regular part of his life. Following the murder of Stephen Twomey in September 1987, Jeffrey Dahmer's psychological barriers against killing had been permanently destroyed, and he began to seek victims with increasing frequency and boldness. The success of his second murder in terms of avoiding detection gave him confidence that he could continue his killing spree without facing consequences, leading to an escalation in both the frequency of his crimes and the elaborate nature of his methods. In January 1988, just 4 months after killing Twomey, Dahmer claimed his third victim, 14-year-old Jamie Edward Dockstader, a Native American boy of mixed Stockbridge and Oneida heritage who enjoyed playing pool and biking. Dockstader was particularly vulnerable due to his young age and the fact that he was often on the streets seeking ways to earn money, making him an ideal target for Dahmer's predatory behavior. His mother, Debbie Vega, would later reflect on his kind-hearted nature, saying, "One my son favorite say from the was, Eve them for they not what do." Dahmer encountered Dockstader at a bus stop and offered him money to come home with him for nude photographs, the same ruse he had used with his first victim Stephen Hicks, and would use with many subsequent victims. The promise of easy money for what seemed like harmless modeling was an effective lure for young men who were struggling financially and had limited opportunities. Dockstader agreed to accompany Dahmer to his grandmother's house, having no way of knowing that he was walking into a death trap. Once at his grandmother's house, Dahmer drugged Dockstader with sleeping pills mixed into an alcoholic drink, a method he had refined since his earlier crimes. When the teenager became unconscious, Dahmer strangled him, then engaged in necrophilia with the corpse before beginning the now familiar process of dismemberment. The body was systematically broken down in his grandmother's basement, with most of the remains disposed of in the household trash, while certain parts were retained for Dahmer's twisted collection. The murder of such a young victim marked a significant escalation in Dahmer's crimes, demonstrating that his appetite for killing was not limited by the age of his victims. The fact that he could kill a child with the same methodical approach he used on adult victims showed the depth of his psychological disturbance and his complete lack of empathy for human life. Dockstader's disappearance was particularly tragic because his family desperately searched for him, not knowing that he had fallen victim to a serial killer who was just beginning his most active period. 2 months later, in March 1988, Dahmer struck again, this time killing 25-year-old Richard Guerrero, whom he encountered at a gay bar. Guerrero, who came from a Mexican family, was lured to Dahmer's grandmother's house with the same promise of money for photographs that had worked so effectively with previous victims. His sister, Janie Hagen, later felt that law enforcement did not take her seriously when she reported him missing, in part due to their ethnicity and the marginalized status of the victims Dahmer typically targeted. The murder of Guerrero followed the same pattern as his previous crimes: drugging, strangulation, necrophilia, and methodical dismemberment. However, Dahmer was beginning to refine his techniques and develop new aspects to his ritual that reflected his growing confidence and his deepening psychological disturbance. He was also becoming more sophisticated in his victim selection, choosing individuals who were unlikely to be immediately missed and whose disappearances would not generate significant police attention. These early murders at his grandmother's house established several important patterns that would characterize all of Dahmer's subsequent crimes. First, he demonstrated a preference for victims who were marginalized and vulnerable, including racial minorities, young gay men, and individuals who were struggling financially. Second, he showed a consistent method of operation that involved luring victims with promises of money or alcohol, drugging them into unconsciousness, killing them through strangulation, and then engaging in necrophilia before dismembering the bodies. Perhaps most significantly, these crimes showed that Dahmer was developing ritualistic aspects to his murders that went far beyond simple killing. The preservation of body parts, the elaborate dismemberment process, and the careful disposal methods all suggested that the murders were serving psychological needs that were becoming more complex and demanding. He was no longer simply killing to satisfy immediate urges, but was developing a comprehensive system of murder that provided him with extended satisfaction and control. The basement of his grandmother's house became his laboratory for experimentation with different methods of killing and body disposal. He tried various chemicals for dissolving flesh and bone, tested different approaches to preservation, and refined his techniques for avoiding detection. The fact that his grandmother remained unaware of what was happening in her own home demonstrated Dahmer's skill at maintaining a facade of normalcy while carrying out the most horrific crimes imaginable. During this period, Dahmer also began working at the Ambrosia Chocolate Company in Milwaukee, a job that provided him with legitimate income and a normal cover for his activities. His co-workers saw him as quiet and unremarkable, having no idea that the man working beside them was systematically murdering and dismembering young men in his spare time. This ability to function normally in society while carrying out a secret life of murder was one of Dahmer's most chilling characteristics. The murders at his grandmother's house also demonstrated Dahmer's growing boldness and confidence in his ability to avoid detection. The fact that he was bringing victims directly to a family member's home, where discovery would have been catastrophic, showed that he believed his methods were foolproof and that he was untouchable. This overconfidence would eventually contribute to his downfall, but for now it allowed him to escalate his crimes without fear of consequences. By the end of 1988, Jeffrey Dahmer had murdered 4 people and successfully concealed all of these crimes from law enforcement. His methods were becoming more sophisticated, his confidence was growing, and his psychological need to kill was intensifying. The stage was set for an even more active period of killing that would claim many more lives and establish him as one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. In September 1988, Jeffrey Dahmer's seemingly unstoppable killing spree encountered its first significant obstacle when he was arrested for sexual assault after attempting to victimize 13-year-old Somsak Synthesumphone, an incident that should have ended his criminal career, but instead became merely a temporary interruption in his path of destruction. This arrest represented a crucial moment when the justice system had an opportunity to prevent future murders, but failed due to a combination of judicial leniency and Dahmer's manipulative abilities. Somsak Synthesumphone was a member of a Laotian immigrant family who had fled their homeland seeking better opportunities in America. Like many of Dahmer's victims, he was young, vulnerable, and from a marginalized community that often received less attention from law enforcement. The 13-year-old was approached by Dahmer with a now familiar offer of money in exchange for posing for nude photographs, a proposition that seemed harmless to a child, but was actually part of a carefully planned assault. Dahmer brought Somsak to his grandmother's house, where he drugged the boy with sleeping pills mixed into an alcoholic drink. Once the child was unconscious and defenseless, Dahmer sexually assaulted him, demonstrating that his crimes were not limited to murder but included a range of sexual violence against vulnerable individuals. However, unlike Dahmer's murder victims, Somsak managed to survive the encounter and escape from the house. The escape of Somsak's synthesome phone represented the first time one of Dahmer's victims had survived to tell authorities what happened. The boy's ability to get away and report the crime to police should have marked the end of Dahmer's criminal career, as he now faced serious criminal charges that could result in significant prison time. The incident was reported to Milwaukee police, who arrested Dahmer on September 27, 1988, charging him with second-degree sexual assault and enticing a minor. The charges against Dahmer were extremely serious and carried the potential for substantial prison time that could have prevented all of his subsequent murders. Sexual assault of a minor was a felony that typically resulted in lengthy sentences, particularly when combined with charges of enticement. Had Dahmer received the kind of sentence that such crimes typically warranted, he would have been incarcerated during the period when he committed most of his murders. However, the justice system failed catastrophically in its handling of Dahmer's case. Despite the serious nature of the charges and the clear evidence of his predatory behavior, Dahmer was able to manipulate the legal process to his advantage. He wrote a letter to the judge expressing remorse for his actions and claiming that he was committed to rehabilitation, a performance that convinced the court to show leniency. The original sentence handed down to Dahmer was 8 years in prison, which would have prevented him from committing any murders during his most active period. However, after serving only 1 year, he was granted early release based on his supposed good behavior and expressions of remorse. This decision to release him early was one of the most tragic mistakes in the history of American criminal justice, as it directly enabled the murders that followed. The terms of Dahmer's early release included 5 years of probation and requirements to undergo counseling and register as a sex offender. These conditions were designed to monitor his behavior and prevent future crimes, but they proved wholly inadequate to contain someone with Dahmer's level of psychological disturbance and determination to continue offending. The probation system simply lacked the resources and expertise to effectively supervise someone who was actively planning to commit murder. Even more tragically, Dahmer was released into the same community where his victim's family lived, creating the potential for additional trauma and violence. The synthesome family, having already suffered through the assault of one of their children, now had to live with the knowledge that their son's attacker was free and living nearby. This situation created an atmosphere of fear and vulnerability that would have devastating consequences for the family. The failure of the criminal justice system to adequately punish and contain Dahmer after the assault of Somsak's synthesome phone represents one of the most significant missed opportunities to prevent mass murder in American history. Had he received and served the full 8-year sentence that was originally imposed, 15 people would still be alive today. The decision to grant him early release was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of his character and the danger he posed to society. The probation period that followed Dahmer's release should have been a time of intensive supervision and monitoring, but instead it became a period during which he refined his killing techniques and selected new victims. His probation officers, lacking training in dealing with potential serial killers, focused on minor compliance issues rather than recognizing the signs of escalating violence. The system was simply not equipped to handle someone who was planning to commit murder while maintaining a facade of cooperation. Most tragically of all, Dahmer's ability to manipulate the justice system and gain early release set the stage for an even more horrific crime against the synthesome family. While still on probation for the assault of Somsak, Dahmer would go on to murder the boy's younger brother Konorak in one of the most shocking and preventable crimes in the history of serial killing. The fact that he was able to victimize the same family twice while under supposed supervision represents a complete failure of the systems designed to protect vulnerable individuals from predators. The Somsak synthesome case also highlighted the vulnerability of immigrant families and minorities to both criminal violence and system failures. The family's limited English and unfamiliarity with American legal systems made them less able to advocate for appropriate punishment of their son's attacker. This vulnerability would be exploited again when Dahmer targeted Konorak, demonstrating how predators specifically seek out victims who are less likely to be protected by social and legal institutions. In May 1990, Jeffrey Dahmer made a decision that would prove catastrophic for numerous victims, he moved out of his grandmother's house and into his own apartment at 924 North 25th Street in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. This transition to independent living removed the last remaining constraint on his behavior and provided him with the privacy and control he needed to escalate his killing to unprecedented levels. The apartment Dahmer rented was numbered 213 in a building called the Oxford Apartments, a 49-unit low-rise complex located in a crime-infested area of Milwaukee's west side that provided perfect cover for his activities. The building housed a diverse mix of residents, many of whom were struggling economically or dealing with their own personal challenges, creating an environment where strange smells, sounds, and activities might not receive the scrutiny they would in a more affluent neighborhood. The decision to move into his own apartment was driven by several factors, including his growing need for privacy to carry out his crimes and his recognition that living with his grandmother was becoming increasingly risky. While Catherine Dahmer had remained unaware of his activities in her basement, the constraints of living in someone else's home limited his ability to bring victims back and spend extended time with their remains. His own apartment would provide the complete control and privacy he craved. Apartment 213 quickly became what one media account later called a private slaughterhouse, where Dahmer could indulge his most twisted fantasies without fear of immediate discovery. The layout of the apartment was ideal for his purposes, with a bedroom where he could subdue and kill victims, a bathroom where he could dismember bodies, and a kitchen where he could use chemicals to dissolve remains. The fact that the building had poor sound insulation meant that screams and other disturbing sounds might not be clearly heard by neighbors. Within months of moving into the Oxford Apartments, Dahmer began bringing potential victims back to his new home. The transition from his grandmother's basement to his own apartment marked a significant escalation in both the frequency of his crimes and the elaborate nature of his methods. No longer constrained by the need to conceal his activities from a family member, he could spend days or even weeks with his victims' remains, indulging in increasingly bizarre and disturbing rituals. The apartment itself became a repository for the evidence of Dahmer's crimes, with body parts stored in the refrigerator and freezer, skulls displayed as trophies, and photographs documenting his activities. When police finally searched the apartment in July 1991, they discovered what they described as a chamber of horrors that defied comprehension. The freezer was covered with Polaroid photographs of mutilated men, and inside they found severed heads, hands, and other human remains. The discovery of the apartment's contents revealed the extent to which Dahmer's crimes had escalated since gaining complete privacy. A closet and filing cabinet contained human skulls, a kettle with decomposing hands and male genitals, and bottles of acid and chemical preservatives. Various body parts were scattered throughout the apartment, creating a scene so disturbing that even experienced homicide investigators were traumatized by what they encountered. The residents of the Oxford Apartments had unknowingly been living in proximity to one of America's most active serial killers for over a year. Many later reported that they had sensed something was wrong, with complaints about a putrid odor of rotting meat that flooded the corridors and the sound of a power saw buzzing at odd hours. Occasionally, tenants reported hearing cries or the thump of falling objects from the second floor, sounds that were actually the death throes of Dahmer's victims. The building's management and other residents had received numerous complaints about the smells coming from apartment 213, but these were typically dismissed as problems with plumbing or garbage disposal. Dahmer himself would claim that the smell was caused by spoiled food or a broken freezer, explanations that seemed plausible enough to avoid closer inspection. His ability to provide reasonable explanations for suspicious circumstances allowed him to continue killing without detection. The location of the Oxford Apartments in a high-crime area of Milwaukee worked to Dahmer's advantage in several ways. First, the neighborhood's reputation meant that police were less likely to investigate minor complaints or unusual activities. Second, the transient nature of the population meant that missing persons reports were less common and less thoroughly investigated. Finally, the economic struggles of many residents meant that they were more likely to accept Dahmer's offers of money for photographs or other services. During his 14 months at the Oxford Apartments, from May 1990 to July 1991, Dahmer would commit 11 murders, representing the most intensive period of killing in his entire criminal career. The privacy and control provided by his own apartment allowed him to refine his methods to a horrifying degree of sophistication, developing techniques for prolonging his victims' suffering and preserving their remains that went far beyond anything he had attempted while living with his grandmother. The apartment also became the site of Dahmer's most disturbing experiments with his victims, including his attempts to create living zombies through brain surgery and chemical injections. Having complete privacy meant that he could spend hours or days torturing victims before killing them, indulging in fantasies of total control that had been developing in his mind for years. The soundproofing and isolation of the apartment meant that victims' screams and pleas for help went unheard by anyone who could intervene. The transformation of apartment 213 into a house of horrors represented the culmination of Jeffrey Dahmer's evolution from someone who occasionally killed to someone whose entire life revolved around murder. The apartment was not just where he lived. It was the laboratory where he conducted his most twisted experiments and the museum where he displayed the evidence of his crimes. When police finally breached its doors, they discovered the physical manifestation of one of the most disturbed minds in criminal history. The period from 1990 to 1991 represented Jeffrey Dahmer's most intensive and horrifying phase of serial killing, during which he murdered 11 victims in rapid succession while developing increasingly elaborate and disturbing methods of torture, murder, and body disposal. This acceleration in killing demonstrated that his psychological compulsions had reached a level where they completely dominated his behavior and drove him to take increasingly reckless chances in pursuit of his twisted desires. The first victim to die in Dahmer's Oxford apartments was Raymond Lamont Smith, a 33-year-old man who went by the name Ricky Beeks. Smith was known for disappearing for extended periods, which meant that his absence was not immediately noticed or reported to authorities. This pattern of victim selection reflected Dahmer's increasing sophistication in choosing individuals whose disappearances would not trigger immediate police investigations. Smith was lured to apartment 213 with the promise of money for photographs, the same ruse Dahmer had been using successfully for years. Once at the apartment, Smith was drugged with sleeping pills mixed into alcohol, then strangled while unconscious. Dahmer then engaged in necrophilia with the corpse before beginning the methodical dismemberment that had become his signature. However, the killing of Smith marked the beginning of new elaborations in Dahmer's methods, as he began experimenting with different techniques for preserving and displaying body parts. The second victim killed at the Oxford apartments was Edward W. Smith, a 28-year-old known as the Sheik, who aspired to be a model. Smith was reported missing on June 14, 1990, when he failed to return from what he had told friends was a photography session. His family became vocal during Dahmer's trial, highlighting the devastating impact his crimes had on the survivors. With Smith's murder, Dahmer began attempting more elaborate preservation techniques, trying to create permanent trophies from his victims' remains. In September 1990, Dahmer committed 2 murders within a matter of weeks, demonstrating that his compulsion to kill was accelerating beyond his ability to control. The first of these victims was Ernest Miller, a 24-year-old aspiring dancer who was preparing to enter an arts college in Chicago. Miller was lured to the apartment on September 2, 1990, and was killed using the same methods that had proven effective with previous victims. His family would remember his talent and potential, making his senseless death particularly tragic. Just 3 weeks later, on September 24, 1990, Dahmer killed David Thomas, a 23-year-old father who left behind a young child. Thomas was described by his ex-girlfriend as fun-loving, and his disappearance left a profound impact on his family and friends. The rapid succession of these murders showed that Dahmer was no longer spacing out his killings over months, but was instead killing as frequently as opportunities presented themselves. During this period, Dahmer also began developing what would become his most disturbing practice, attempting to create living zombies through crude brain surgery and chemical injections. This horrifying experimentation reflected his desire to have complete control over his victims, not just to kill them, but to transform them into compliant slaves who would satisfy his sexual desires indefinitely. These experiments involved drilling holes into victims' skulls and pouring various substances directly into their brains, including muriatic acid, boiling water, and other chemicals. The lobotomy experiments Dahmer conducted on his victims represented some of the most sadistic and inhumane acts in the history of serial killing. Using medical knowledge he had gained during his military service, he would sedate victims and then drill holes into their skulls with power tools. He would then inject various substances into their brains in an attempt to destroy their higher brain functions while keeping them alive. These procedures invariably resulted in the victims' deaths, as the human brain cannot survive such massive trauma. Despite the failure of his zombie experiments, Dahmer continued to refine and repeat these procedures with each new victim, demonstrating a level of sadistic experimentation that went far beyond simple murder. The fact that he persisted with these experiments, even though they never produced the results he desired, showed that the process of torture and mutilation had become as important to him as the killing itself. Each victim became a test subject in his twisted laboratory of human suffering. The frequency of murders during this period also meant that Dahmer was accumulating human remains in his apartment at an unprecedented rate. His refrigerator and freezer were packed with severed heads, hearts, and other body parts, while skulls were displayed around the apartment as macabre trophies. The apartment began to reek with the smell of decomposition, leading to complaints from neighbors that Dahmer would dismiss with excuses about spoiled food or plumbing problems. The Polaroid photographs Dahmer took during this period documented his crimes in horrifying detail, showing victims in various stages of dismemberment and displaying the elaborate poses he would arrange their bodies in after death. These photographs served multiple purposes for Dahmer. They allowed him to relive his crimes, provided documentation of his experiments, and satisfied his desire to maintain control over his victims even after their deaths. The methodical nature of his photography demonstrated the calculated and organized aspects of his crimes. During 1991, Dahmer's killing reached its peak intensity, with 7 murders committed in the first 7 months of the year. This acceleration reflected his growing inability to control his compulsions and his increasing boldness in taking risks to satisfy his desires. The rapid succession of murders also meant that he was becoming sloppy in his methods, accumulating evidence, and behaving in ways that were bound to attract attention. The most tragic murder of this period was that of 14-year-old Konorak Sinthasumphone, the younger brother of Somsak Sinthasumphone, whom Dahmer had assaulted in 1988. This murder was particularly horrific because it demonstrated that Dahmer was specifically targeting the same family he had already victimized, and because it involved a police encounter that should have saved the boy's life, but instead resulted in his being returned to his killer. The murder of 14-year-old Konorak Sinthasumphone on May 27, 1991, represents one of the most shocking and preventable tragedies in the entire Jeffrey Dahmer case, a horrific crime that was enabled by police indifference, racial prejudice, and a catastrophic failure of the systems designed to protect vulnerable individuals from predators. This case has become emblematic of the broader social failures that allowed Dahmer to continue killing for so long, demonstrating how marginalized communities were failed by law enforcement and how close Dahmer came to being caught before claiming even more victims. Konorak Sinthasumphone was the younger brother of Somsak Sinthasumphone, the 13-year-old boy whom Dahmer had sexually assaulted in 1988. The Sinthasumphone family had immigrated to the United States from Laos in 1979, seeking better opportunities for their 8 children. They had already endured the trauma of Somsak's assault and Dahmer's subsequent early release from prison, living in fear that he might strike their family again. Tragically, their worst fears would be realized when Dahmer targeted their youngest son. On May 26, 1991, Dahmer encountered Konorak at the Grand Avenue Mall in Milwaukee, where the 14-year-old was spending time with friends. Despite the fact that he was still on probation for the sexual assault of Konorak's older brother, Dahmer approached the boy and offered him money to come to his apartment to pose for photographs. The teenager, unaware of Dahmer's previous crime against his family and needing money, agreed to accompany the man who had already devastated his family. At apartment 213, Dahmer followed his established pattern of offering his victim a drink laced with sleeping pills and halcyon. Once Konorak was unconscious, Dahmer took photographs of him and then began his most horrific experiment yet. Using a power drill, He bored a hole into the boy's skull and poured diluted hydrochloric acid directly into his brain in an attempt to create a living zombie who would be completely under his control. The procedure was conducted with the same methodical precision that characterized all of Dahmer's crimes. However, unlike many of Dahmer's previous victims, Konarak did not die immediately from the brain trauma. Instead, he regained consciousness while Dahmer was away from the apartment, apparently shopping for more supplies. In a state of confusion and distress from the brain injury and drugs, the 14-year-old managed to escape from the apartment, stumbling naked and bleeding into the street. This escape should have marked the end of Jeffrey Dahmer's criminal career and the salvation of numerous future victims. The sight of a naked, bleeding, and disoriented child wandering the streets immediately attracted the attention of several residents in the area. 3 women, Nicole Childress, Sandra Smith, and Tina Spivey, discovered Konarak and immediately recognized that he was in desperate need of help. Despite his drug-induced confusion and the brain injury that impaired his ability to communicate, it was clear to these women that the child had been severely traumatized and needed immediate medical attention. Nicole Childress called 911 to report the emergency, and Milwaukee Fire Department paramedics quickly arrived on the scene. The medical personnel immediately recognized that the child needed emergency treatment and began preparing to transport him to a hospital for care. At this crucial moment, with proper medical intervention just minutes away, a series of catastrophic decisions by law enforcement would seal Konarak's fate and allow Dahmer to continue his killing spree. Officers John Balcerzak, Joseph Gabrish, and Richard Prupkin arrived at the scene in response to the emergency call. Rather than supporting the medical personnel's assessment that the child needed immediate hospital treatment, the officers made the decision to send the ambulance away. This decision was made despite the obvious signs of trauma and distress exhibited by Konarak and the urgent pleas of the women who had found him. When Dahmer arrived at the scene, having returned from his shopping trip to find his victim missing, he immediately began manipulating the situation with the same calculated deception that had served him so well in previous encounters with law enforcement. Despite the presence of a naked, bleeding child and the testimony of multiple witnesses who insisted something was seriously wrong, Dahmer convinced the officers that Konarak was his 19-year-old boyfriend who had simply had too much to drink. The 3 women who had discovered Konarak, Nicole Childress, Sandra Smith, and Tina Spivey, desperately tried to provide the officers with crucial information that could have saved the boy's life. They explained that Konarak was clearly just a child, not an adult as Dahmer claimed. They told the officers that the boy was trying to escape from Dahmer and that he had been calling Konarak by different names. They emphasized that he was drugged, hurt, and had obviously been sexually abused. Most importantly, they tried to communicate that Konarak was attempting to physically escape from Dahmer's control. However, instead of listening to these critical pieces of information, the officers dismissed the women's concerns and even threatened to arrest them if they continued trying to help Konarak or provide information about what they had witnessed. Officer Balcerzak and his colleagues told the women to shut the hell up and treated the situation as nothing more than a domestic dispute between adult homosexual partners. This dismissive attitude reflected both homophobia and racial prejudice, as the officers were quick to disregard the testimony of African-American women trying to help an Asian child. The decision to believe Dahmer's story over the testimony of multiple witnesses was influenced by several factors, including the officers' prejudices and their lack of training in recognizing the signs of sexual abuse and human trafficking. Dahmer's calm demeanor and ability to provide consistent answers to questions helped convince the officers that he was telling the truth, while Konarak's inability to communicate effectively due to his brain injury and drug intoxication was interpreted as evidence of voluntary intoxication rather than victimization. The officers made the catastrophic decision to escort both Dahmer and Konarak back to apartment 213, effectively delivering the victim directly into the hands of his killer. During the walk back to the apartment, Konarak showed obvious signs of fear and reluctance, but these were ignored by the officers who had already accepted Dahmer's version of events. The fact that a child was being forced to return to an apartment against his will should have raised immediate red flags, but the officers were operating under assumptions that prevented them from recognizing the true nature of the situation. Once inside apartment 213, The officers conducted a cursory inspection that failed to detect any of the overwhelming evidence of Dahmer's crimes that filled the apartment. They found Konarak's clothing and saw Polaroid photographs that they interpreted as evidence of a consensual homosexual relationship rather than documentation of sexual abuse. Most tragically, they failed to detect the smell of decomposition that was emanating from the body of Anthony Hughes, who had been murdered just 3 days earlier and whose remains were decomposing in another room of the apartment. The officers' failure to conduct a thorough search of the apartment represented a missed opportunity of staggering proportions. Had they looked more carefully, they would have discovered human skulls, body parts in the refrigerator, bottles of acid, and photographic evidence of multiple murders. Instead, they accepted Dahmer's explanations and left Konarak alone with his killer, satisfied that they had resolved what they believed was a minor domestic dispute. Within 30 minutes of the officer's departure, Jeffrey Dahmer murdered Konarak's synthesome. He injected another dose of hydrochloric acid into the hole he had already drilled in the boy's skull, this time in sufficient quantity to cause immediate death. Dahmer later confessed, "I listened for a heartbeat right after I injected him, and there was none. I wasn't trying to kill him. But that's what happened." The boy who had so nearly escaped became Dahmer's 13th victim, killed by the same man who had already victimized his older brother. The failure to save Konarak's synthesome had consequences that extended far beyond this single tragedy. By returning the boy to his killer, the officers enabled Dahmer to commit 4 more murders over the following 2 months before he was finally arrested. Joseph Breithoft, Oliver Lacey, Matthew Turner, and Jeremiah Weinberger all died because the police failed to recognize that they had encountered a serial killer and his victim on May 27, 1991. The aftermath of Konarak's murder led to significant controversy and legal action against the Milwaukee Police Department. The synthesome family filed a federal lawsuit against the city and the officers involved, arguing that their civil rights had been violated and that the police response had been influenced by racial and homophobic prejudices. The case went to trial in March 1995, and by April, the city agreed to pay the family $850,000 in settlement. The 3 officers involved in the incident faced disciplinary action from the police department. Officers Balcerzak and Gabrish were initially fired for their handling of the case, but they appealed their terminations and were subsequently reinstated with back pay of $55,000 each. This reinstatement was seen by many as a further injustice, suggesting that the police department did not take the officers' failures seriously. Balcerzak later served as president of the Milwaukee Police Association from 2005 to 2009. The Konarak synthesome case became a symbol of the systemic failures that enabled Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes to continue for so long. The case highlighted how racial minorities, immigrants, children, and LGBTQ+ individuals were failed by systems that were supposed to protect them. The fact that officers could encounter a serial killer in the act of victimizing a child and not only fail to recognize the situation but actually facilitate the completion of the crime demonstrated profound failures in training, judgment, and basic human decency. The tragedy also illustrated how Dahmer's ability to manipulate authority figures and present a calm, reasonable facade enabled him to continue killing even when he was caught in compromising situations. His success in convincing the police officers to ignore obvious signs of abuse and return his victim to him demonstrated the sophisticated psychological manipulation skills that made him such an effective predator. The fact that he could commit this manipulation while a child's life hung in the balance showed the complete absence of empathy or conscience that characterized his personality. Following the murder of Konarak's synthesome in May 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer's killing spree entered its final and most reckless phase, during which he committed 4 more murders in rapid succession while accumulating so much physical evidence in his apartment that discovery became inevitable. This period demonstrated that his psychological compulsions had completely overwhelmed any concern for self-preservation, leading him to take increasingly dangerous risks that would ultimately result in his capture. The first victim to die after Konarak was Matthew Turner, a 20-year-old man from Flint, Michigan, who aspired to be a model. On June 30th, 1991, Dahmer encountered Turner at a Chicago bus station and convinced him to travel to Milwaukee with the promise of a professional photo shoot. Like so many of Dahmer's victims, Turner was young, attractive, and seeking opportunities to advance his modeling career, making him vulnerable to Dahmer's promises of legitimate work. Once at apartment 213, Turner was drugged with sleeping pills mixed into alcohol, then strangled while unconscious. Dahmer dismembered the body and placed Turner's head and internal organs in separate plastic bags in his freezer, adding to the growing collection of human remains that was overwhelming his apartment's storage capacity. The fact that Turner was not reported missing meant that his disappearance initially attracted no police attention, allowing Dahmer to continue operating without detection. Just 5 days after killing Turner, on July 5, 1991, Dahmer claimed another victim, 23-year-old Jeremiah Weinberger, whom he encountered at Carol's Speakeasy Bar in Chicago. Weinberger, who was of Jewish Puerto Rican descent and worked at a video store, was lured to Milwaukee with the promise of spending the weekend with Dahmer. Despite having reservations about going with a stranger, Weinberger was ultimately persuaded by Dahmer's charm and apparent sincerity. The murder of Jeremiah Weinberger was particularly horrific because Dahmer did not kill him immediately, but instead kept him alive for several days while conducting his zombie experiments. After drugging Weinberger, Dahmer drilled a hole in his skull and injected boiling water directly into his brain in an attempt to create a compliant sex slave. When this procedure failed to produce the desired results, he repeated it with acid, sending Weinberger into a coma from which he died 2 days later. The prolonged torture and experimentation that Weinberger endured represented some of the most sadistic behavior in Dahmer's entire criminal career. The fact that he was willing to keep a victim alive for days while conducting painful and ultimately fatal medical procedures showed that his desire for control had evolved into pure sadism. The basement laboratory that Apartment 213 had become was now being used for extended torture sessions that went far beyond simple murder. On July 15, 1991, Dahmer encountered his next victim, 23-year-old Oliver Joseph Lacey, at the corner of 27th and Kilbourne in Milwaukee. Lacey was engaged to be married and had recently become a father, but was struggling financially and was attracted by Dahmer's offer to pay him for posing nude for photographs. Like so many before him, Lacey had no way of knowing that accepting this seemingly innocuous offer would cost him his life. The murder of Oliver Lacey demonstrated that Dahmer's methods were becoming increasingly elaborate and time-consuming. Rather than killing Lacey quickly, Dahmer intended to prolong the experience and spent an entire day attempting to render him unconscious with chloroform while keeping him alive. He even called his workplace to request time off so that he could devote himself fully to the torture and murder of his victim. When the chloroform experiments failed to produce the desired state of conscious but compliant victimhood, Dahmer eventually strangled Lacey and had sex with the corpse before dismembering the body. He placed Lacey's head and heart in the refrigerator and his skeleton in the freezer, further crowding his apartment with human remains. The methodical preservation of body parts had become so routine for Dahmer that he was running out of space to store his gruesome trophies. Just 4 days after murdering Lacey, on July 19, 1991, Dahmer received word that he had been fired from his job at the Ambrosia Chocolate Company. Rather than viewing this development as a warning sign that his behavior was becoming too erratic to maintain normal employment, he saw it as an opportunity to devote himself more fully to killing. On the very day he learned of his dismissal, he lured 25-year-old Joseph Bradehoft to his apartment. Joseph Bradehoft had recently moved to Milwaukee and was seeking employment when he encountered Dahmer. Like the other victims, he was attracted by the promise of easy money for photographs, having no way of knowing that he was about to become the final victim in one of America's most horrific killing sprees. His murder on July 19, 1991, marked the end of Jeffrey Dahmer's 13-year career as a serial killer. The murder of Joseph Bradehoft followed the same pattern as Dahmer's other recent crimes: drugging, strangulation, and methodical dismemberment. However, by this point, Dahmer's apartment had become so overwhelmed with human remains that he was forced to leave Bradehoft's body lying on his bed covered with a sheet for 2 days. When he finally removed the sheet on July 21st, he found the head covered with maggots, a sign that his ability to manage the physical aspects of his crimes was breaking down. The accumulation of human remains in apartment 213 during this final period created a situation that was unsustainable and bound to attract attention. The refrigerator and freezer were packed with severed heads, hearts, and other body parts, while skulls were displayed around the apartment as trophies. A 57-gallon blue drum filled with acid contained the dissolving torsos of multiple victims. The apartment reeked with the overwhelming smell of decomposition that could no longer be disguised or explained away. The Polaroid photographs that Dahmer took during this period documented his crimes in unprecedented detail, creating a visual record of torture, murder, and dismemberment that would later serve as crucial evidence in his prosecution. He had accumulated 84 photographs showing victims in various stages of dismemberment, providing investigators with irrefutable proof of his crimes. These photographs were stored in a bedside drawer where they would be easily discovered by police. By July 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer had transformed apartment 213 into what investigators would later describe as a house of horrors that defied comprehension. The 11 murders he had committed at this location had created a scene so disturbing that even experienced homicide detectives would be traumatized by what they encountered. The apartment contained 7 human skulls, 2 human hearts, a bag of organs, numerous severed body parts, and chemical preservatives scattered throughout the living space. The physical evidence that had accumulated in the apartment made Dahmer's eventual capture inevitable. The overwhelming smell of decomposition, the sounds of power tools at odd hours, and the accumulation of suspicious activities had already attracted the attention of neighbors and building management. Several residents had complained about the odors and sounds coming from apartment 213, and it was only a matter of time before these complaints would trigger a more thorough investigation. Most importantly, Dahmer's behavior had become increasingly reckless and erratic as his psychological compulsions overwhelmed his ability to maintain the careful facade that had protected him for so many years. The rapid succession of murders, the accumulation of evidence, and his inability to properly dispose of remains all indicated that his criminal career was approaching its inevitable conclusion. The only question remaining was whether he would be caught before he could claim more victims. On the evening of July 22nd, 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer's 13-year reign of terror finally came to an end when Tracy Edwards, a 32-year-old man from Mississippi, managed to escape from apartment 213 and flag down Milwaukee police officers, leading to the discovery of one of the most horrific crime scenes in American criminal history. Edwards' escape was the result of extraordinary courage and determination, and his survival quite literally saved the lives of countless future victims who would have fallen prey to Dahmer's escalating bloodlust. Tracy Edwards had come to Milwaukee seeking work and a better life, but like so many of Dahmer's victims, his economic struggles made him vulnerable to the killer's practiced deceptions. On that fateful July evening, Edwards encountered Dahmer at a local bar, where the serial killer employed the same combination of charm and false promises that had worked so effectively with previous victims. Dahmer convinced Edwards to accompany him back to his apartment with promises of beer, money, and the opportunity to watch movies together. Initially, the encounter seemed harmless enough, with Dahmer playing the role of a friendly acquaintance offering hospitality to someone who was new in town. Edwards later recounted that they chatted casually and that Dahmer seemed like a normal person, showing no obvious signs of the murderous intentions he harbored. This ability to present a completely normal facade was one of Dahmer's most dangerous characteristics, allowing him to lure victims into his trap without arousing suspicion. However, once Edwards was inside apartment 213, Dahmer's behavior underwent a dramatic and terrifying transformation. The friendly, charming persona disappeared, replaced by something far more sinister and threatening. Dahmer began to exhibit the controlling and predatory behavior that had characterized his interactions with all of his previous victims, making it clear that Edwards was not free to leave and that his life was in immediate danger. The turning point came when Dahmer rested his head on Edwards' chest and began chanting along with the movie The Exorcist, which was playing on the television. This bizarre behavior was followed by an even more alarming escalation when Dahmer produced a large butcher knife and threatened to kill Edwards and eat his heart. The threat was delivered with the calm, matter-of-fact tone that Dahmer used when discussing his most horrific fantasies, making it clear that this was not an idle threat but a genuine promise of what was to come. Realizing that he was facing a life-or-death situation, Edwards began to employ psychological tactics to delay his seemingly inevitable murder. He engaged Dahmer in conversation, pretending to be interested in his stories and fantasies while desperately looking for an opportunity to escape. Edwards later described this conversation as the most terrifying experience of his life, as he listened to Dahmer describe in detail how he intended to kill him and what he planned to do with his remains. During this horrifying conversation, Dahmer showed Edwards some of the Polaroid photographs he had taken of his previous victims, images that depicted men in various stages of dismemberment and death. The photographs served as both a form of psychological torture and a clear demonstration of what Edwards could expect if he failed to escape. The sight of these images, combined with the smell of death that permeated the apartment, left no doubt in Edwards' mind about Dahmer's intentions or capabilities. Edwards also noticed other disturbing evidence of Dahmer's crimes during his time in the apartment, including skulls that were being used as decorations and the overwhelming stench of decomposition that filled the space. The accumulation of evidence was so overwhelming that even someone who had never seen a crime scene could recognize that they were in the presence of a mass murderer. The apartment had become a museum of death that documented Dahmer's crimes in horrifying detail. The critical moment came when Dahmer attempted to handcuff Edwards, an action that would have rendered him completely helpless and sealed his fate. However, Edwards was able to resist and prevent Dahmer from securing both handcuffs, leaving one of his hands free. This small but crucial advantage gave him the mobility he needed to fight back when the opportunity presented itself. When Dahmer became distracted or momentarily let his guard down, Edwards seized his chance and punched him in the face with enough force to stun him temporarily. With Dahmer momentarily incapacitated, Edwards ran for the door and managed to escape from the apartment, despite still having one handcuff attached to his wrist. The escape required tremendous courage and quick thinking, as Edwards had to overcome both his physical restraints and his psychological terror to break free from a situation that had claimed the lives of so many others. Once outside the building, Edwards ran through the streets of Milwaukee, frantically seeking help while still wearing the handcuff that served as visible evidence of his ordeal. At approximately 11:30 p.m., he encountered Milwaukee police officers Robert Roth and Rolf Mueller, who were patrolling the area in their squad car. Edwards flagged them down and desperately explained that he had just escaped from a freak who had tried to kill him and that he needed their help to remove the handcuffs. The officers initially treated Edwards with some skepticism, as his story seemed almost too bizarre to believe. However, the presence of the handcuffs and Edwards' obvious state of terror convinced them that something serious had occurred. When their standard handcuff keys failed to remove the restraints, Edwards agreed to lead them back to Dahmer's apartment so they could confront the person who had done this to him. The decision to follow Edwards back to apartment 213 was the moment that Jeffrey Dahmer's criminal career finally came to an end. As they approached the building, the officers could smell the overwhelming odor of decomposition that emanated from Dahmer's apartment. This smell, which neighbors had been complaining about for months, was so strong that it immediately alerted the officers that they were dealing with something far more serious than a simple assault case. When the officers knocked on the door of apartment 213, Dahmer answered and initially attempted to maintain his usual facade of calm respectability. He acknowledged knowing Edwards but claimed that their encounter had been consensual and that Edwards had simply become upset over a misunderstanding. However, his explanations became less convincing as the officers noticed the overwhelming smell coming from inside the apartment and Edwards' insistence that Dahmer had tried to kill him. The officers asked for permission to search the apartment, and Dahmer, perhaps believing that his usual manipulative abilities would allow him to talk his way out of the situation, agreed to let them inside. This decision sealed his fate, as the apartment contained so much evidence of his crimes that concealment was impossible. The officers immediately noticed boxes of hydrochloric acid scattered around the floor and the overwhelming smell of death that permeated the space. The discovery that ended Jeffrey Dahmer's freedom came when Officer Rolf Mueller opened a bedside drawer and found the collection of Polaroid photographs that documented Dahmer's crimes in horrifying detail. The 84 photographs showed victims in various stages of dismemberment, torture, and death, providing irrefutable evidence of multiple murders. Mueller was so shocked by what he saw that he exclaimed to his partner, "These are for real," before immediately placing Dahmer under arrest. Upon seeing the photographs, Dahmer realized that his carefully constructed facade had finally collapsed and that his criminal career was over. Rather than continuing to deny his crimes or attempting to flee, he made a statement that revealed his understanding of the magnitude of what he had done. "For what I did, I should be dead. This admission of guilt marked the end of 13 years during which he had successfully concealed his identity as one of America's most prolific serial killers. The arrest of Jeffrey Dahmer on July 22, 1991, represented not just the end of his individual criminal career, but also the beginning of a broader reckoning with the systemic failures that had allowed him to continue killing for so long. Tracy Edwards' survival and escape had prevented what could have been many more murders and had finally brought justice for the 17 victims whose lives had been taken by one of the most disturbed individuals in criminal history. The search of Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment 213 in the Oxford Apartments complex revealed a scene of horror that defied the imagination of even the most experienced homicide investigators, transforming what had initially appeared to be a simple assault case into one of the most shocking multiple murder investigations in American criminal history. The systematic examination of Dahmer's living space over the following days would uncover evidence of crimes so disturbing that they challenged the very limits of human comprehension. The initial entry into the apartment by officers Roth and Mueller had already revealed enough evidence to justify Dahmer's arrest, but the full scope of his crimes only became apparent as investigators began a methodical search of every room, closet, and container in the space. What they discovered was not simply a crime scene, but rather a carefully organized museum of death that documented Dahmer's 13-year career as a serial killer in horrifying detail. The refrigerator in Dahmer's kitchen contained what investigators initially thought might be food items, but which proved to be severed human heads wrapped in plastic bags. The freezer was similarly packed with human remains, including more heads, hands, and other body parts that had been preserved for Dahmer's later use. The casual way in which human remains were stored alongside normal household items demonstrated the complete normalization of murder and dismemberment in Dahmer's daily life. In a closet, investigators discovered a collection of human skulls that Dahmer had been using as decorations and trophies. These skulls had been carefully cleaned and preserved, with some showing evidence of the drilling and chemical treatments that were part of Dahmer's zombie experiments. The skulls were arranged almost like a shrine, suggesting that they held special significance for Dahmer and represented more than mere souvenirs of his crimes. A filing cabinet in the apartment yielded additional skulls, and a kettle containing what forensic experts determined to be decomposing hands and male genital organs. The methodical organization of these remains suggested that Dahmer had developed a complex system for cataloging and preserving the evidence of his crimes. Each container and storage location seemed to serve a specific purpose in his elaborate ritual of death and preservation. The discovery of a 57-gallon blue drum filled with acid and containing dissolved human torsos represented one of the most disturbing aspects of the crime scene. This container held the remains of multiple victims who had been systematically dissolved using chemicals, demonstrating Dahmer's sophisticated understanding of body disposal techniques. The acid bath method allowed him to eliminate large amounts of physical evidence while retaining the body parts that held special significance for him. Throughout the apartment, investigators found bottles of various acids and chemical preservatives that Dahmer used in his dismemberment and preservation processes. These chemicals included muriatic acid, which he used both for dissolving bodies and for his brain injection experiments, and various industrial solvents and preservatives. The quantity and variety of chemicals suggested that Dahmer had developed considerable expertise in the science of death and decomposition. The collection of 84 Polaroid photographs that had led to Dahmer's arrest proved to be one of the most crucial pieces of evidence in understanding the full scope of his crimes. These photographs documented every aspect of his murder process, from the initial drugging of victims through their deaths and the subsequent dismemberment of their bodies. The methodical nature of the photography demonstrated that Dahmer viewed his crimes not just as impulsive acts of violence, but as carefully choreographed performances that deserved documentation. The photographs showed victims in various poses, both before and after death, revealing the ritualistic aspects of Dahmer's crimes that went far beyond simple murder. Some images showed the elaborate positioning of bodies that Dahmer arranged to satisfy his sexual fantasies, while others documented his experiments with drilling and chemical injection. The collection served multiple purposes for Dahmer. It allowed him to relive his crimes, provided a record of his techniques, and satisfied his need to maintain control over his victims even after their deaths. Power tools found throughout the apartment provided evidence of the methods Dahmer used to dismember his victims. Electric saws, drills, and other equipment bore traces of human blood and tissue, confirming their use in the brutal process of body disposal. The presence of these tools, combined with the chemical supplies and storage containers, painted a picture of an operation that was both methodical and industrialized in its approach to murder and dismemberment. The apartment also contained evidence of Dahmer's zombie experiments, including syringes, drill bits, and containers of the various substances he had injected into victims' brains. Medical equipment and supplies suggested that he had been attempting to conduct crude surgical procedures on his victims, using knowledge gained during his military medical training for the most horrific purposes imaginable. The failure of these experiments was evident from the fact that all victims had died, but Dahmer's persistence in attempting them revealed the depth of his desire for complete control over other human beings. Personal items belonging to the victims were scattered throughout the apartment, providing investigators with crucial evidence for identifying the remains and linking them to missing person reports. Wallets, identification cards, jewelry, and clothing helped establish the identities of victims whose remains had been too severely damaged for conventional identification methods. These personal effects also served as tragic reminders that each set of remains represented a real person with a life, family, and dreams that had been destroyed by Dahmer's violence. The living conditions in the apartment revealed the extent to which Dahmer's life had become completely consumed by his obsession with death and murder. Normal household activities had been subordinated to the requirements of killing and dismemberment, with every room serving some function in his elaborate ritual of violence. The kitchen had become a dissection laboratory, the bedroom a killing ground, and the bathroom a place for disposing of evidence. As the investigation expanded beyond the apartment itself, investigators began the painstaking process of identifying the remains and linking them to specific victims. This work was complicated by the advanced state of decomposition of many remains and Dahmer's efficient disposal methods, which had eliminated much of the physical evidence that would typically be available in homicide cases. Forensic experts worked for months to identify victims and reconstruct the timeline of murders. The discovery of remains in various stages of preservation provided insight into Dahmer's evolving methods and the timeline of his crimes. Fresh remains indicated recent murders, while older skeletal remains suggested killings that had occurred months or even years earlier. The variety of preservation methods also revealed Dahmer's experimentation with different techniques for maintaining his collection of human trophies. The sheer volume of evidence discovered in apartment 213 overwhelmed the Milwaukee Police Department's ability to process it quickly. Specialized teams of forensic experts were brought in to catalog and analyze the hundreds of pieces of evidence, from photographs and personal effects to chemical samples and human remains. The investigation required months of painstaking work to fully document the scope of Dahmer's crimes and prepare the evidence for prosecution. The impact of discovering such a horrific crime scene extended far beyond the immediate investigation. The officers and forensic experts who processed the apartment were traumatized by what they encountered, with many requiring counseling and support to deal with the psychological impact of their work. The scene was so disturbing that even hardened homicide investigators, who had seen the worst of human violence, were unprepared for the level of depravity they encountered in Dahmer's apartment. Following his arrest on July 22, 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer began what would become one of the most comprehensive and disturbing confessions in the history of American criminal justice, a 178-page document that detailed 17 murders spanning 13 years and provided investigators with a horrifying glimpse into the mind of one of the nation's most prolific serial killers. The confession process, which took place over more than 60 hours of interviews with Detective Patrick Kennedy and later Detective Dennis Murphy, revealed not only the scope of Dahmer's crimes, but also the methodical and calculated nature of his approach to murder. Dahmer's decision to confess fully and voluntarily to his crimes was both surprising and significant. Rather than maintaining his innocence or attempting to minimize his culpability, he waived his right to have an attorney present during questioning and explicitly stated his intention to confess everything. He told investigators, "I created this horror, and it only makes sense I do everything to put an end to it," a statement that suggested both an understanding of the magnitude of his crimes and a desire to finally unburden himself of the secrets he had carried for so long. The confession began with Dahmer's account of his first murder, the killing of 18-year-old Stephen Mark Hicks in Bath Township, Ohio, in June 1978. He described in chilling detail how he had picked up the hitchhiking teenager and brought him to his parents' home, where he killed him with a barbell and then dismembered the body. This admission confirmed what investigators had suspected but had been unable to prove, that Dahmer's criminal career had begun much earlier than his recent Milwaukee murders. Dahmer's description of the 9-year gap between his first murder and his resumption of killing in 1987 provided crucial insight into the development of his compulsions. He explained that during this period, the urges to kill had never left him, but that circumstances had not aligned to provide him with the opportunity and privacy necessary to act on these impulses. His military service, periods of unemployment, and living arrangements had all served as constraints that prevented him from killing, but the desires had continued to grow stronger over time. The confession revealed the methodical nature of Dahmer's victim selection and killing methods. He described how he would frequent gay bars and other locations where he could encounter potential victims, always looking for individuals who were vulnerable, isolated, and unlikely to be immediately missed if they disappeared. His preferred targets were young men who were struggling economically, members of racial minorities, or individuals who were estranged from their families. Dahmer's account of his killing methods demonstrated the evolution of his techniques from crude violence to sophisticated procedures. While his first murder had been committed in a moment of rage using a barbell, his later crimes showed careful planning and the development of refined methods for rendering victims unconscious, killing them, and disposing of their bodies. The progression from simple strangulation to elaborate chemical experiments revealed the increasing complexity of his psychological needs. The most disturbing aspects of Dahmer's confession involved his descriptions of the zombie experiments he conducted on his victims. He explained to investigators his desire to create compliant sex slaves who would be completely under his control, and described in detail the procedures he used in attempting to achieve this goal. These experiments involved drilling holes in victims' skulls and injecting various substances directly into their brains, procedures that invariably resulted in death, but which Dahmer continued to refine and repeat. Dahmer's confession provided specific details about each of his 17 victims, including how he had encountered them, the methods he used to kill them, and what he had done with their remains. This information was crucial for investigators who were attempting to identify victims and provide closure to families who had been searching for missing loved ones. The detailed nature of his admissions also helped establish the timeline of his crimes and confirm the identities of victims whose remains had been too severely damaged for conventional identification. The confession also revealed the extent of Dahmer's necrophilia and cannibalism, practices that had not been fully understood from the physical evidence alone. He admitted to having sex with the corpses of his victims and to consuming parts of their bodies, explaining that these acts made him feel as though his victims were a permanent part of me. These admissions provided insight into the psychological motivations behind his crimes and the complex ritualistic aspects of his behavior. Perhaps most chillingly, Dahmer's confession revealed his complete lack of empathy for his victims and their families. He spoke about the murders in the same matter-of-fact tone he might use to describe a routine household chore, showing no apparent emotional reaction to the suffering he had caused. This emotional detachment was evident throughout the confession process and suggested a level of psychological disturbance that went far beyond normal criminal behavior. The confession also provided details about Dahmer's methods for avoiding detection, including his techniques for disposing of evidence and maintaining a normal facade while carrying out his crimes. He described how he would dissolve bodies in acid, dispose of remains in household trash, and use air fresheners and other methods to mask the smell of decomposition in his apartment. His ability to maintain employment and social relationships while committing regular murders demonstrated sophisticated compartmentalization abilities. Dahmer's admissions about his interactions with law enforcement revealed several missed opportunities to stop his killing spree. He described encounters with police officers, including the incident involving Conorak Synthesum, and explained how he had been able to manipulate these situations to avoid detection. These revelations highlighted the systemic failures that had allowed him to continue killing for so long. The psychological profile that emerged from Dahmer's confession painted a picture of someone whose capacity for violence had no apparent limits. He admitted to considering kidnapping and killing potential victims who had escaped his initial attempts to lure them to his apartment. He also described fantasies about constructing elaborate killing chambers and expanding his operations to claim even more victims. victims. These admissions suggested that his arrest had prevented what could have been an even more extensive murder spree. The confession process also revealed Dahmer's understanding